Hello and welcome. This is week 5 science. We're looking at the science of food, and we're not so much looking at the structure of the food and the actual components of it, although I will briefly talk about it. What we're looking at much more here is actually the science around how we're interpreting the signals that are coming from our food, so how our bodies are actually interpreting the signals. So we're going to begin by actually having a look at the basic constituents of food, which are made up of macronutrients and micronutrients, and we talked more about this earlier on. I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but effectively major macronutrients are water, fats, proteins and sugars of different kinds, and the body just needs some of these, and the body's capable of making a lot of these different compounds from other compounds. So for example, we can turn protein into sugar quite readily, and we can turn sugar into fat, fat back into sugar, and so on. The body's making proteins continuously as well. There are some proteins that we can't make, and so we need to be able to eat them. And in addition to these sort of macronutrient components, we obviously have all the micronutrient components. There's certain vitamins which the body can't make, have to eat. Obviously things like sunshine provide us with some vitamin components as well. And in addition to that, we have the real micronutrients, which are the various salts and minerals that are required for the body to function peak performance. One factor that I'd like to talk a little bit about, which we don't often hear about in the conversation around food, is that our body is continuously recycling, and indeed if it weren't to recycle tremendous amounts of nutrients, then our food needs would be astronomically higher than they are. Next week we're going to be looking at appetite, and we'll be talking in depth around the signaling that's going on within the body. So in other words, we've got all this food coming in, and the amount of it that's coming in is driven largely by appetite. So habits and patterns and behaviours and that type of thing are in there as well, but really they're all a part of this appetite process. So we'll go on to that in much greater detail later. So given the approach to food that we're taking, and we've identified in the philosophy video, what we're really looking at is actually how we are individually relating to our food. So at a cellular level, how we are relating to the food. And this is happening on many, many levels within the body. The body is actually learning on the basis of the information that it's getting, and the food is an incredible supply of information. So the actual scientific component nature of the food, as well as these other impressions that we're talking about in the earlier video. But all of this is actually coming in as information which the body takes into account and learns from and adapts to, and the body is changing considerably. Now, most people who are on the TRIM program, so within the membership here, are people who have had quite an experience with food over many years. So they're people who tend to developed a lot of patterns and habits around how they're actually adapting to the food. So the things that are expressed within their body today haven't necessarily been expressed in them throughout their entire lifetime. And generally speaking, when we look at young children, although this is changing with the onset of childhood obesity that we're seeing exploding around the world today, but generally speaking, people when they're much younger, so when they're small children, don't have this dysfunction in terms of how they're relating to food. Why is this? It's because their bodies have been adapting and learning from the food over a long period of time. So over the years, the body is continuously adapting and learning to how it's actually handling this information that the food represents. So the food's bringing all this information into them, and the key piece of information here is that the body is adapting continuously to that food. Now, we're familiar with the idea of the microbiome, and particularly the biota that are living within our gut, and was it 70 trillion bacteria living within the body, a huge percentage of which are actually living in the digestive tract, a very large proportion of those 70 trillion organisms. And those 70 trillion organisms are continually communicating with our own cells, and they're communicating information about the food that they're in contact with. So these bacteria are digesting the food and interacting with the food, and they're learning continuously, and how that food actually then is coming to be actually tied into us is very important. So the actual process that goes on there is that the bacteria are communicating via the nervous system. So the bacteria is sitting on one side of the gut wall, and the nervous system is sitting on the other side of the gut wall, along with the immune system and the circulatory system and all the rest of it. But the information is actually coming across into the nervous system, is being interpreted there and taken to the brain for further processing. So that's the way in which the biota is making that communication. And of course the biota is changing as we are aging as well, and it's doing that because of the maladaptation that we're making to what's happening with this food. So because we're not well adjusted to the food, it means that the biota is continuously changing as well and becoming further and further maladapted. Now there are very many research papers published on the way in which this biota is communicating to the brain and to the other aspects of the body, and indeed once again we can look at the explosion of certain types of behaviours like ADD, ADHD, autism, and so on and so forth. So these are generally speaking, we're considering these to be childhood disorders, and what's being expressed within you perhaps at the moment in terms of this dysfunction in the relationship to food is becoming evident in younger and younger age children. So the explosion in autism, for example, is excellent evidence to suggest and support the concept that what we're really talking about is we've actually got a maladaptation between the food, the microflora within the gut, and our bodies, and hence our brain. So we talked yesterday about these ideas of gratitude and acceptance versus fear, greed and selfishness, profit motive and whatnot. So we've got these not so much competing, but they're allied principles that are going on in terms of the psychology or consciousness that we're talking about here. And the question then becomes, well, how does all of that actually impact on the actual biology? So we're talking about the scientific functioning of what's happening within our bodies. Well, the answer relates to stress, and all of the things that we're talking about there are stresses which come into the body, and everything from epigenetic factors to the actual learning systems within the body. So in other words, how the brain is learning and how it's reconfiguring itself, along with all of the other systems within the body. So it's not just relating only to the brain, but all of the systems within the body, particularly things like the immune system, the entire endocrine system, are all learning and adapting continuously to what's coming in. These factors, these consciousness factors that we're talking about, are all stress, and the stress is actually impacting on the way in which these functions are occurring within the body. So I just want to finish up now. It's quite a short video today on the science around food. As I say, we're going to talk much more about the nutrition components, and particularly relating to the issues around appetite. So in other words, how we are going to go out and procure this, the supply of, or the fulfillment, if you like, of the appetite. But I just want to briefly talk about a common psychological condition which impacts on many people, many members of TRIM, and indeed on myself. So like I've suffered from clinical depression, and part of the we talk about these impulses for me to actually develop TRIM. Well, one of the big ones is actually around becoming better adapted to the food, so that the pressure on the systems which create depression become lessened. So, because of my own personal experience, I feel very deeply about this, obviously. So, the biota within the intestines, particularly in the small intestines, are continually in contact with the brain, and we're talking about these stresses and that type of thing. When the biota become maladapted, as is happening more and more frequently within our modern society, so within our bodies, within the modern society, then the signalling that's coming directly from the intestines via the nervous bundle is called the vagus nerve. It's a huge bundle of nerves that are travelling up into the brain, and this communication is coming up, and it impacts directly on the neurochemical balance. So people are finding in this research that they're doing that dependent on the type of food that you're eating, so for example what the sugar balance is like, and particularly the types of sugars and the relationship on the slow release sugars versus the quick release sugars and so on, is having this kind of impact. It's such a strong stress on the brain, this information that's coming out via the vagus nerve, and the information which is coming out from the small intestines that I've talked about before. There's something along the lines of 20 million neurons, which are brain cells actually within the small intestine, so they're processing all this information that's coming about the food, and it's the relationship between the food, the microflora in our bodies, and this information is coming up into the brain. Now, the strength of this information that's coming in, the stresses that are implied within it, particularly relating to matters around sugar, whether there's a lot of high release sugar versus slow release sugar in the food, and indeed how that's impacting on the biota, and so in other words how the population distribution is being moved and so on, is all streaming up the vagus nerve into the brain. The stress and this pressure of this information that's coming through from the vagus nerve into the brain is such that it can completely change the biochemistry of the brain, and creating all of these stress hormones within the brain which lead to the actual physical changes within the brain which lead to depression. So we're talking about structural changes occurring in relationship to information that's coming from the small intestines. There's abundant research to actually support these concepts and what we're talking about. So here's an example of the relationship between the food and the nervous system and the brain and the biochemical processes, all of these processes that are occurring within the brain, and a psychological condition falling out from it, such as depression. Okay, well look, I hope you found this useful. As I say, we're going to expand much of the science when we have a look at appetite. We're going to go much more into how the body can be very selective about what it's looking for in terms of nutrition, and indeed the whole subject of nutrition really needs to be focused on in another video, or perhaps multiple videos, which we'll look to doing as bonus material. However, for the moment I just want to be very clear about the scientific metabolic processes, the biochemical processes that are going on, where the actual nature of the food, so the stress that's within the food, is migrating all the way through into your body.